start with this last part of doing the same sort of issue. So we go one step further. So before was about writing the manuscript. Now you go to your perfect manuscript. Yes, you don't, unlike Jimmy said, you don't keep it. And now you want to raise them and give them the best possible option to do. And that's what this next step starts. I mean, the point being, you have something, now you want to yeah, give value to what you did. Try to publish it in a good place, try to find a good place where to publish it, so on and so forth. So that's basically the main point. Then within this point, there is also the issue of selecting the place that you select the kindergartens for your kid or the primary school. You buy a house next to the good primary school and so on and so forth. The selecting journal is going to be on Friday morning, but today Marco will say a few things, we'll see, I mean, a few things before, and then if you have time at the end, only from a social perspective. Because one of the points that I think was already said today by Marina and also by Jan is that basically there is a sort of context that you need to take into account, audience, the type of audience you are writing for, determines also what you do. So the journal selection is also within the same area. You can have different journals with different kind of styles, different kind of emphasis, with different kind of pluses and minuses. So that's part of the journal selection. So it's social. You might look at different things than personality, or clinical. There are different kind of angles. As a starting point, basically as a backbone of this kind of slot, which I hope is going to be as interactive as possible. So we're going to share like in this kind of anonymous alcoholics. And they say, hello, my name is Juliette, and my paper has been rejected twice. So I'm going to tell you why this. So this kind of stories, all those stories that everyone of us has passed through. And but anyway, so that's the kind of idea. But we use as a backbone the presentation by Marco Brambilla that we wisely invited because we anticipated the people that done the job of preparing a PowerPoint. Whereas we lazy boy didn't do it. So Marco, please, thanks for coming.
So hi everyone. So I just prepared a couple of slides because I can't speak without slides. But feel free to interrupt me anytime. So let's keep this very informal, even if I have some slides. So basically, as we said, you write your manuscript, and once you have the manuscript, you have to select the manuscript. You have to select the journal. Of course, you should keep in mind at least a couple of journals in mind before writing the paper, because every journal has specific rules. And has been said before, depending on the number of studies you have and the kind of methodology you employed, you can submit a paper as a full article if you have like 3, 4, 5 or even more experiments. Last month I reviewed a paper with 13 experiments for JPSP. When I arrived like at the fourth, I couldn't remember the first, so it was like a mess. If you have like 1 or 2 experiments, you can submit the paper as a brief report, or if you do like a meta-analysis or a review paper, you select a journal that publishes that kind of work. You know, other things you can keep in mind when you select the journal. The first one is very basic, but in my view is important. You should find a journal that the aim of the journal fits with your perspective. So if you have a work that is very nice work, but everything is correlational, there is no reason to submit that paper to a journal that in the mission statement states that accepts only experimental work. Even if your work is, let's say you have 9 works, 9 studies, all correlation, very nice, but nothing is experiment, that paper is gonna, likely that paper is gonna reject your paper. So I usually try to keep in mind this thing when I select the journal. Audience, that's important. If you work I do basic psychology, so I most of the time submit my papers to journals that are read only by academics. But if your work is more applied and you want to reach a broader audience, you may want to submit your paper to a journal that is read not only by academics but by professionals or stakeholders more in general. Reputation is a big one. The reputation of the journal. Most of the time when we speak about reputation, we think about impact factor. Impact factor is just one piece that relates to a reputation. There are other things that relate to reputation, and I think you are going to talk about this stuff on Friday. The editorial board, my previous supervisor gave me this suggestion. So when you have to submit a paper, look at the editorial board of the journal to look for friends or enemies. Because let's say that you work on a model and you build a new model that criticize or try to develop a previous model. And in the editorial board, there is the professor who developed the model, the first model. That person can be very, very open and can be very happy to see his or her work improved, or can be even very pissed because you are trying to criticize the model, you are trying to say that the model is good but not that good. So maybe that person can have a negative first impression of your work, and maybe you want to avoid a journal in which that person is either the editor or the assistant editor, perhaps. Or you can look at the editorial board more broadly and see that maybe in the editorial board there is someone who works on your topic and uses the same perspective, and perhaps that could be a good fit for your work. At least you know there is someone that works on your topic and that is competent, highly competent to review your work. Time to publication. So right now that I'm 42, time for publication is not an issue for me. So if I submit a paper and then I get a feedback like after 6 months, even if it's a rejection, I can be pissed, but it's not an issue. But when I was a PhD student, when I was trying to build my CV, I needed publication and need them fast. So you used to submit a paper to a journal that you know, or in your lab, other people submitted a paper to that journal, and you know that the journal takes forever to get a feedback, and maybe that feedback is a rejection. If you are at the end of your PhD and you want to apply for a postdoc position and you need some publication, maybe it would be better to select another journal that perhaps has a faster review process. Fees. At least in social psychology, most journals publish your paper for free. But there are some very prestigious journals like Natural Human Behavior, PNAS, that ask you to pay if you want to publish the paper. This is something you would like to keep in mind. So my PhD student wants to publish in Natural Human Behavior, but we don't have the money to publish there. So if you don't have the money, your lab doesn't have the money, there is no reason to look at this journal. Because even if you submit something that is going to change psychology forever, that journal is not going to publish your work unless you pay. Once the paper has been accepted, they need the invoice saying, okay, you pay $2,000. If you don't pay, even if the paper is perfect, that is not going to be published. So it's something you want to keep in mind. And ethical standards. Most journals ask you to have the approval of the ethics committee from your university. Other journals have other rules in terms of ethical standards. You need to provide the data, the analysis, and everything. In my lab, we are pretty open about that, so we always pre-registered everything, and then we upload on Open Science Framework all the materials, everything we have. But if for some reason you have an issue with sharing your data or your materials, I don't know if they are protected by copyright or stuff like that, you should keep in mind and you should look at the journal, you should look at what the rules are, because for some journals it's mandatory to upload everything. So once I work on face perception and we use some faces that were protected by copyright, and the first author, he didn't want to upload the materials, and we had to select a journal that allowed us to publish the paper even without uploading all the materials. Can I say something?
I think what Marco said, are kind of general rules, then of course you have more specific things, but for the different fields, my kind of specifics, but we're going to go either at the end of the day, if you have time, to start to, otherwise on Friday is more about the specifics of different fields.
Okay, but do you think one about the types of papers? So there's also very interesting new types of papers like registered reports. So that's really good to know about, especially if you have a high risk study that involves a lot of clinical populations or patients or whatever, or that's difficult to conduct. Then I would really recommend this format, because then you can submit basically your introduction and your methodology, and you'll get comments on that, and then you'll get a stage 1 acceptance, which basically says that if you do what you said you've done, we will accept your paper regardless of what the results are. So registered reports are a really good format for all research, basically, because it really increases also the quality of the research. You get the input at the time that you need it. And if you've gone through the first stage, then it's basically guaranteed to be published unless you did something. And then there's registered replication reports, so you can also do replication papers. And there are even now with, I think it's Cortex, who started this, that they have the reanalysis papers, so that you can actually do reanalysis of existing studies, so that you have the data, existing data, and reanalysis on that. It's a reproduction papers, I think.
If you want also to verification reports.
Oh, yeah. Verification. Yeah, and then maybe something to say there. Opinion papers is missing also from this list. I tend to write quite a number of opinion papers, but unfortunately there are very few journals that consider this. So here especially think about, that's a type of paper that you have to think about where you will publish it. Especially open access journal, I don't know any open access journal except for Collabra.
Well, I guess you have to put in the context of a special issue. Open access. If you have a special issue, one of the papers could be, you can put among the papers this. But it's true, in some journals these are called target papers. For instance, in Personal, the European Journal of Personal now is one of the top journals within Personal. It has impact factor. It's second only to check, no, not even second.
Or second.
Second, yes, good. But other than that, it's about everyone else. Every other journal there. One of the reasons is because they, over the years, have been used quite a lot of the strong target papers, with a lot of kind of opinions, and then they have been cited a lot by the people. Because often this is well done. I mean, this is something which might be unrealistic at the initial stage of the campaign, because it's unlikely that you can do. The ambition, you could, but I mean, it's not so much realistic at the beginning, but still it's something that I can see, in any case, it's very useful in terms of literature to do, because you have something, or you can start to think at some point, when you start with some kind of substantial stuff, as a kind of idea, you think you can try to go for a target paper. Basically, theoretical paper, which other people are literally trying to kill you, in the sense of trying to find anything that doesn't go well, and so people will say, okay, that's great. And then at the end, you get through like everyone. So that's the kind of
even with prospectus, perspective on
No, current opinions in psychology, but it's not
current opinion in psychology and in journal of social issues, but the problem is that it's invitational. Current opinion in psychology is only invitational.
Psychology in psychology, I think it's no. Then you have another one, psychological inquiry. And then you have, of course, the one, the most famous of them all is behavioral brain science testing, where basically they start with behavioral brain science. That's the top job in this sense, from this kind of form over the years. BBS, behavioral brain science.
There's a lot of
2007, nine. The Houwer, Mitchell, and Ludlow, a paper about proposition, lots of comments on that. I think that's been perhaps the first, or certainly the most famous in this kind of form. And then after it has spread across all students.
And even if it is invitational, sometimes you can try to write the editor and say, I have this nice idea, perhaps you might want to consider it. I tried once with current opinion and the editor said no. And I tried the second one with advanced in experimental social psychology, and the editor said, let's submit a full version of the manuscript and then I can decide. You take the risk, if you're lucky, you can have a theoretical paper published in a nice journal.
Sometimes they even post with a job as well, open course.
One thing I want to reinforce the thing about editorial board, and also that this changes. So you could have a journal where you have friendly people on the editorial board. The board changes, and you better stop trying there because you see your success rate go down drastically with the same. So that's a very important one. And then for author fees, just to be complete, good journals have waivers for ATC. So if your lab does not have the funds to publish in a journal, check whether they do waivers, and then they should offer you, if you really cannot pay it, a good journal should offer you the possibility to publish anyway.
So the plus one, I mean, among the open journals, I think they separate the acceptance and the fees, and if you don't get it, they publish it.
Yes. Also, another one is you have different types of open access journals. So you have what we call the fair open access ones, and they justify their fee. So they really say, okay, you pay so much and not that so much goes to that, and their real publishing costs so much for waivers and so on. So and typically they are now around 1,000 euros. So that's basically the fair price that you pay. Everything above 1,500 is not fair. Plus one is on the border of that.
Frontiers.
Frontier is just profiteering.
Rather than frontiering. Occasionally, you also have what I call direct journals, which you can publish, open access for free. This is paid for, like this, personality science. It's a new journal within personality. It's 2 years now, 3 years. That basically some 2 years, it's subsidized by the European Society of Personality Psychology, that is basically paying for the costs associated with production, which means basically it's a standard editorial process. It's open access, it is for free. So no one pays anything except for the society that subsidizes.
Some universities, for instance, our university has an agreement with Wiley, and you can publish open access in any journal published by Wiley for free, so the university covers all the expenses.
So 2 more things about that. One is never do double dipping, so never pay an open access fee when it's already being published without access fee. So you have journals that have membership, and they say, would you like to publish also open access? And then you have to pay another 2,000 or 3,000 euros. You never do that because for them it's double dipping. They profit from the fees, the subscription fees, and then they try to earn money from open access also. Second thing was Sherpa. So the Sherpa ACH.UK or something like that. It's a website where you can check the green open access policies of journals. Sherpa UK.
Yeah, something like that.
And that's very important because every journal also has rules about green open access. So you have Diamond, which is completely open for everybody for free. Then you have Gold, which is open access for everybody, but you pay for it. And then you have Green, which is basically it's your preprint or the manuscript as accepted. You can put that on your own website or on ResearchGate and so on. And that's also open access, but it's not in the format of the publisher. And every journal has rules about it. Like the Elsevier journals are really bad because they say they put an embargo of 1 year. Some journals even have embargoes of 2 years before you can share even your version as accepted. And then there are rules about whether you can share it on your own website or whether you can also share it on ResearchGate, which is basically a private company. So always, for our lab, I made a list basically of the good journals and the bad journals. And Sherpa, you can find all information on Sherpa.
From this perspective, now there is, besides impact, there is also the top score. Top score basically is a score of the openness of the journal. In terms of this kind of criteria, you have an overall score that is reflecting this kind of transparency, open access, and so on and so forth. And then at the end, it's data. You have a final score that is summarizing this category. It's not as known as the impact factor, but still it's something that if you are interested in open science, is something that could be something to check, consideration, to see what your target journal, how it scores from this perspective.
The journal of the two journals like H2020 and personal science have like some of the top scores in psychology.
And hence in the whole of science, because psychology scores very well.
Okay, so once you have your paper, you submit the paper to the journal you select. And what happens? What happens that if you are unlucky, the paper could be thus rejected. So the editor says, thank you for submitting your manuscript. You know what? I think your paper will be, that does not fit very well with the journal, please submit somewhere else. If you're lucky enough, the paper will be handled by an assistant editor who gives the paper to reviewers that, depending on the journal, could be between 2, 3, usually, I mean, social psychology usually is 3, sometimes 4, but it's very unlikely. Let's say 3 most of the time. And the review process could be either double blind, single blind, or open. So double blind means that only the assistant editor knows the author's name. So neither the reviewers nor the author knows the identity of the people who wrote the paper. Single blind means that the authors do not know the reviewers, but the reviewers know the authors. And open means that the names are fully disclosed at the beginning or even at the end of the review process. Of course, if you are a reviewer, I don't know if you review a couple of papers, sometimes I sign the review. Even if the policy of the journal is double blind, sometimes I sign and say, my name is Marco Brambilla, I'm reviewing this paper. You are always free to do it. And the authors know, in this case, the name of the reviewers. This for me is very important. So when I submit a paper, I always ask my collaborators to write a cover letter. And for me, the cover letter is not just, dear editor, we are pleased to submit the paper. Thank you for your patience, blah, blah, Marco Brambilla. That's not a cover letter. Of course, you're submitting a paper. A cover letter shouldn't be very long, but you should provide some information. I put here two examples. This one is very short. So you say at least in one sentence how many experiments you have and what did you do. In this second version, which I prefer, this is a little bit larger. At least in the you say you are telling to the editor how many experiments you run, what your paper is about, and why you think that that paper could fit with the journal, and why that paper you think might be important in the field. And this helps the editor, in my view, to select the reviewers, select the assistant editor, and decide whether is it worth continuing the review process. Now that I'm lucky enough and I'm an assistant editor for a journal, and I really appreciate when the authors write in the cover letter some details about the studies, so I can think about reviewers even before then looking at the abstract and going through the manuscript.
Just to jump on that a little bit, I found that really useful too. I've had really positive experiences when I've written a cover letter to journals describing the goodness fit between current studies and the ones and the journal has been like alluding to one or two studies that have previously been published in that journal that are related to the topic. Because I mean, your experience is an associate editor, maybe could put light on it. I guess I imagine that if you get a submission, you might not be inclined. You might get a view on a bad day or something, and you're like, I don't know if this fits the journal. But if you literally say you guys published this stuff in the past, it really clarifies that. I don't know if you think that's something helpful or.
Yeah, for me it's very helpful. So when you receive a letter and they are telling you explicitly why they think that the paper fit with the journal, unless most of the time I go with the review process. When the cover letter is very short and you go maybe through the abstract and the paper, sometimes you have second thoughts and you say sure, and maybe you just reject. But when you have a detailed clear cover letter, in my view the authors did a great job, because they look at the paper, at the previous papers, the statement of the journal, and say okay, they did a great job, so let's continue and see what happens.
Just in the spirit of different perspectives, I never, when I was editor, I never looked at cover letters. and no, I didn't. I just went to the abstract, and because I also rarely saw anything in the cover letter that was not in the abstract. And the abstract for me contained all the information I wanted, needed to have. On the other hand, I don't see anything wrong with what you suggest. So I guess maybe it can only help, unless you start giving like impression that you're manipulating. It shouldn't evoke reactants also.
Yeah, sure.
That's what could go wrong in cover letters. But if you don't do that, my hunch is that most of the time they will not be read. But I believe.
Ok, io vado a casa.
No, but let somewhere in between, in the sense of that I did like you did, since I didn't so, but I think that on average, they like Marco suggests. I think that on average is effective what Marco suggests. So if I have to recommend something, I would say do as Marco suggests, but be careful. There is a thin line over which can be perceived a creative element. So you have to be, in that kind of give information which is not perceived to be an attempt to strategically manipulate the editor so that, or oversell. I mean, even then, I guess depends on countries. I would expect that depending on the culture of the countries. I guess I don't want to be too much stereotypical, but I guess, for instance, in USA, it's more commonplace to market your stuff. It's considered more normal. As it were, in Europe, we have a tendency to be a bit, okay, don't make it too big, this stuff. So you can avoid this kind of differences. I guess that you want to play safe. You want to play, we increase your value. Do as Marco suggests. Not, I'm an exception. I think. The exception. Most people do like Marco says, so I think it's a very good suggestion. But be careful not to overstep in that. So try to find the right line. So you can stay.
Okay.
Shall we return to the issue of desk rejections at some point? Will we return to it, or can I make a comment about it now? So desk rejections, that's a really tough one as an editor. Desk rejections, you can do it for different reasons. It's not a good fit with the journal, or you immediately see problems with it. That's okay. But my experience is that a lot of times with the journals who think they have a high reputation, that they do desk rejections because they think the level of contribution is not good enough. So desk rejection is because of level of contribution, that they make like a first scan of it and then say, yeah, this doesn't look important enough for us. And in that case, it is good to go, because desk rejections are made out of the old view of a journal. We have that many pages, and we can only, we must fill those pages, but we don't have anything more. Because every page costs the publisher a lot of money. So they offer you a certain amount of pages, and they say fill it, and they want it to be filled, but they won't allow you to have extra pages because it costs money. And then that's where a lot of the desk rejection idea comes from, because no, that's not for us, it's not good enough, the left is not good. But that's when you have old style publishing. And now if you look at new style publishing, like journals like Collabora, for example, they explicitly say level of contribution is not a criterion. And then that's also at the level of desk rejection, you will get much less desk rejection at those journals, which I think is good, because level of contribution is a really tough one. You can say, as an expert, as an editor, you can say I'm an expert in the field, but desk rejections can also really hurt a field. An editor imposes certain views on what is being even considered in publications.
I never desk reject a paper based on the level of contribution, but most of the time I desk reject a paper because the paper doesn't fit with the journal name, or more importantly, when you see like a methodological flaw that it's not going to be solved with a review, like low power or a manipulation that clearly doesn't work well. In that case, I write the authors and say, look, I mean, the paper has a nice idea, but there is a methodological problem, and you should first fix this, and then if you want, you can restore it. Stuff like that. But in other journals like Sex Science, they reject a lot because the level of contribution is too low, or I mean, you are very, very young, but a couple of years ago, if you wanted to submit a paper to Journal of Experimental Social Psychology and you worked on implicit measures, the editor was Laurie Ruttman. And if you work on implicit association, that was fine, but any other implicit measure that were unrelated to EIT, the likelihood of being desk rejected was very, very high because she doesn't like it. Or like the AMP, she desk rejected because she didn't like the measure, but luckily I think this is not very, very common right now, at least in social psychology.
I remember experiences like that with her. She was really bad.
Yeah, I know.
And she imposed her views. She used desk rejection as a tool to impose her views.
She was removed, by the way, by the journal 1 year before the end of the term. Because she was very, very tough. So she didn't like the topic, I don't like the topic, that's rejection. That's very unfair. Okay, ethics. Either in the cover letter or in the submission process, you have some fields that you have to fill, like of course everything should be approved by the ethics committee. In Italy, this was not very, very common, so we published hundreds of studies without the approval of ethics committees. But right now, in the same 10 years, everything has to be approved. Open science. Some journals encourage to be open, and some others, how can I say this politely? Even if they don't tell you explicitly, I mean, they tell you you can submit the paper even if you do not pre-register, even if you do not share the materials. Basically, they are going to reject the paper if you are not willing to do so. For instance, in social psychology, social personality and psychological science, if you submit a paper and at least one study is not pre-registered, the likelihood of being that's rejected, not that's rejected, but rejected at the end is very, very high because they value very much open science and they implicitly force you to have at least one pre-registered study, which in my opinion is good. I mean, we should pre-register everything. Or at least in our research project, something should be pre-registered. I pre-registered everything. Uh, you may want to say in the cover letter that you pre-registered or not your experiment and if you have an open approach or not. Some journals ask you to tick if you follow some statement of open science. Conflict of interest. This is very tricky. But
can I, a side note on pre-registration? Somebody, I think, might be scared of deviation of pre-registration. So you have pre-registration, and then at some point when you really do the analysis stuff, you discover that I didn't really take a risk step. Or by doing this analysis, things are even better. You didn't know that there was this analysis available. And so on. These things happen, that's science. Don't be fixated to the pre-registration. You can do a deviation to the pre-registration, document or explanation. These are people. So you are talking to people. You can explain to people, to colleagues, why, instead of doing what you said, you did this one. You could have things like, for instance, you can have a supplementary material which you do the original analysis. You can show that perhaps it's an improvement as opposed to, okay, we do this, and then there is nothing. You get a good result which shows there is some raise eyebrows, perhaps, something like this, because of why it is prepared. Don't be, don't think that it's something that forces you to do only what you said to do. You have to do that because of you. But you can do also other things as long as you can explain in a kind of articulate way why you are doing these other things. And there is nothing wrong with that. It's part of science. Such a correct process. I'm saying this because I've seen the back reaction to the registration. People say, oh no, I can register, I can't do anything else. No, you can't. But yeah, there are ways.
Even in the pre-registration, you can, for instance, sometimes I don't have a clear prediction in the pre-registration. I explain which kind of analysis I would perform. And in terms of prediction, you can say in the pre-registration, there may be three possibilities. I mean, one possibility would be this effect according to this theory. The second possibility would be this effect according to this another theory, and the third possibility could be another one. So you disclose that you have I mean in mind what you want to do, but you don't know and you don't have a clear hypothesis because you are exploring. You can do so as well. I mean, I do most of the time.
Yeah, I don't know, but sometimes as we think and as a way to say, okay, we just can't.
I never had a problem with the pre-registration even when results didn't fit or I deviated from the pre-register protocol, nobody complained. Only once with the power analysis to JPSP, so we declared a specific power analysis, then the power analysis we realized after the review process that was not ideal, so we did another power analysis and at the first round they said, oh, this power analysis it's wrong, do another power analysis. We did. And they said, do it again. And we did. And then they said, oh, but this power analysis is not included in the pre-registration. It's not included in the pre-registration because we didn't know that the power analysis was the right one. So they rejected the paper because they asked us to do another power analysis, and that power analysis wasn't included in the pre-registration, or just one. It happened once. So. Yes, almost. Conflict of interest. So if you have any sort of conflict of interest with some reviewers and some action editor, you should include in the cover letter or even in the submission form. In my lab, we don't.
You know, if you have to publish a book on habits, you know what to gather. Conflict of interest. Somebody that you don't want to
So where you don't want, I mean,
yeah,
I don't do this because I mean, if you know that there are some reviewers that they will not see your paper in favor unless you have a strong conflict of interest. I would not recommend to write anything in the cover letter. I don't want this reviewer because I don't like this reviewer because this reviewer has an approach that is different from mine. For me, in my opinion, this is not a good reason. Of course, if you have one reviewer that you had a fight and he punched you on the face, you can say something, you can write that that person is not ideal to review your paper. Otherwise, at least in my lab, we never say we don't want this reviewer for whatever reason.
I've also not done it for papers, but I have done it for grant applications.
Okay.
Because with grant applications, it can really be that one reviewer will get you down. So there I have done.
I have done once one thing, I must confess. So once, every time I work on a specific topic, which is the negative effect in impression formation, I always get the same reviewer, John Skowronski, and he always rejects, always, because he doesn't. He has his theory published in 1987, and if if the paper fits, it's fine. Otherwise, rejection. And we had a couple of papers rejected by him, and once I didn't know how to cope with this, but I didn't want to write the editor, I don't want this reviewer. So the idea I came up with was to send the paper to John Skowronski, asking for a feedback. Of course, he said this is completely shit. And then when I submitted the paper, I wrote, John Skowronski could be a nice reviewer, but please keep in mind that I sent him the paper and he already provided me a feedback, so maybe maybe you want a fresh new reviewer. It's a way to avoid that person in a nice way. I did just once, and the paper was rejected anyway.
So maybe that's why. That's actually very smart.
But what you can do, some journals ask you to do so, is to suggest reviewers. And as an assistant editor, I found this extremely helpful because sometimes I handle papers in fields that I do not know very well. So as long as the authors provide some suggestions that are not friends, previous supervisors, or previous collaborators, I found this a nice way to tell the editor and the assistant editor, you know, maybe you're not familiar with the topic. These 2 or 3 people might be a good reviewer, and we don't have anything to do with them. We have never collaborated. We don't have any relationship with them.
As starting as an editor, I find it difficult because I look at the suggested reviewers. Then what I do, I go to Scopus or Google Scholar, check what they publish, if they publish together, and try to get this idea that they are related, or maybe they are the same, research group. They publish a lot with the same people. So I try to get this sense because, and this is, I mean, it's not that easy to see, to understand whether they are, best friends forever or really independent from the others. So I mean, since I never, for example, just use suggested reviewers. Maybe pick one, and then the others I pick among people who are next.
I guess that's another point that you could bear in mind. That sometimes you can think of this as like you can anticipate it's going to have a positive. Doesn't mean that it's worth it. But you can find other people that could balance this out. So at the end, you can give more weight to these other people and you can see how it goes. So also that is a possibility. Depends on many considerations. But what I mean is that sometimes research is so much entrenched. So especially when there are the kind of things in which it's difficult to find people who didn't do anything at all with someone else.
Yeah.
I also wonder if it's risky to recommend reviewers because, for instance, imagine that you recommend a reviewer that actually these ones have a negative opinion of the work, then you look like a bit of a fool regarding the editor. Because, okay, I mean, of course you would recommend people who be likely to like your work, and then if they don't, isn't it even worse that you recommended them in the first place?
wouldn't look at it that way. I would simply look at the quality of the arguments that the reviewer provides. So if it's good arguments, then I would be happy, regardless of whether you propose that reviewer or not.
I'm just talking to you guys, but I was wondering, in my experience, how do you cope with the fact that it's very difficult now to find reviewers, generally speaking? So if you have to keep in mind all these rules of balance, adjust and balance for sometimes it's just difficult to find people that accept because you have to find the interviews. So how do you cope with this problem, which is a problem?
I haven't had to cope because I stopped editing in 2020, I think. But it had become much more difficult to find reviewers than at the time when I was doing. I started in 2006 or something with cognition and emotion, and already in those 7 years, I saw it become much more difficult, but it has become even more difficult. What I now find is that if editors ask me and I say there is a potential conflict of interest, so I always report whatever I think would be relevant, then they say, but as long as I know, I'll take that into account. And they would prefer to have a review of somebody who has a conflict of interest than to not have a review. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was even somebody who was a former PhD student, the author was a former PhD student, and the editor nonetheless insisted that I should do it, but in the end I thought it was too close. It shows how desperate editors are.
You keep trying. If the authors provide you at least 3 or 4 names, you try the. I always try to have at least one of these as a reviewer, and then I pick 2 other ones. And if everybody says no, I have like 3 or 4 people there. They work basically on everything, and they are always very, very friendly. And when I write them, they know that I am at the end. And they say, okay, yes, yeah. Otherwise, you can ask people who rejected the invitation to provide some names. Maybe someone in the lab, some graduate students, and stuff like that. But yeah, it's complicated. It depends also on the timing. At least in social psychology, you know that in May, June, everybody's going to reject because they are going on vacation. February and March is not good timing for the Americans because everybody are at SPSP, which is an important conference. Everybody rejects. So if the paper you are looking for reviewers on February, you should go to Europeans. Yeah, but keep trying.
And offer extra time. So say, okay, I can't do it, yeah, but if you have an extra month,
possible outcomes, we know what the possible outcome could be. Rejection, the most frequent one. Major revision or minor revision. So minor revision, it happens once in a million, but yeah. Rejection is the most common. When I get a rejection, most of the time I submit elsewhere. Even if they ask me to collect new data, I do, but I tend to submit it to another journal. Unless the editor writes in the cover letter, even if I reject the paper, you are allowed to resubmit the paper in the journal. If the rejection letter doesn't say so, most of the time I submit elsewhere, or I write an email to the main editor after a while saying, the paper was rejected, but we ran 3 more experiments, we think we'll have a stronger paper. Can we submit the paper again here? And most of the time they say, yes, you can do, but the process will start again from the beginning. What I do not do is when a paper is rejected after a revision, I do not like taking the paper and submit the paper somewhere else without any changes, because reviewers are always the same, and the likelihood of finding a reviewer, even in the second journal, that review the paper in the previous journal could be high, and if the reviewer see that you didn't change anything, that's not good. So you can, if of course the paper should be entirely rewritten is one thing, but if the one reviewer says that you should run one additional experiment because you have a confound, and you think that the confound is real, I would prefer running the experiment, change the manuscript, and then submit somewhere else. I don't like after a rejection, let's try the next one on the list. I mean, at least in my lab, we don't like to do so.
I agree completely, and that's a very important point. Also, if you're a reviewer yourself and you get a paper that you rejected at another journal and you see the same, and that people did not take into account your comments, that's for me a closed case. But that's that we always be responsive to reviewers. Always try to learn from reviewers. Reviewers are there to help you, and you can learn from them.
Because reviewers are always right.
Yeah, almost right. Even if they reject.
I have a question regarding this very specific example. So, for instance, if you are if you have a reviewer on the paper and then in a different journal and then you get rejected, and another journal is asking for the exact same paper, and I can see that the paper is actually what do you like? Do you say I only use this paper and this was my
yeah, I sometimes just given that nothing has changed, here is the review I submitted last time.
Yeah, I agree. So I just brought a couple of examples of rejection you can have, because I mean, most journals are run by Americans, and Americans like to be very polite. So the first two sentences are always about how amazing your work is. You submitted that's always the first sentence. But the real letter starts at the third sentence, that usually starts with however, and that however changes completely the meaning of the first two sentences. And most of the time is however we found some flaws, however we found some rejection. And you take it, and then you moved from there. Bye.
One thing that I think it's obvious for all people in this room, but was obvious for some people there. Everything before the however is automated, so they don't actually write it. It's just there in the system and they write it.
They don't think that.
So yeah, it's not an honest feedback. It's automated.
We were very impressed about the quality of your work. You nicely, however, and rejection. So major revision could be a nice major revision in which you have to rewrite some section of the manuscript. Sometimes major revisions they sound like a rejection because they ask you to rewrite the manuscript or maybe rerun the studies or run new studies, and it takes a lot. My suggestion would be, as long as you get a major revision, even if when you read it, it seems like a rejection, as long as a major revision, try it. Maybe you're lucky, or maybe it's going to be a rejection, but if an editor gives me the opportunity to revise the manuscript, even if it's very, very tough, I usually go to that path. Even if the first day I receive the major revision, I say, I can do that. Let's change the journal, but then after one night, I say, okay, they are giving me the opportunity to improve the manuscript, so the door is not completely closed. Let's try, let's fight.
Especially taking into account that the other options are very rare, like minor revisions is 10%, 5% of the time, maybe?
It happens to me just once.
And immediate acceptance is non-existent. That doesn't happen. So you have most likely outcome, as you said, is a rejection, and then you have major revision, and then this 5 or 10% maybe a minor. So you have to try. Major revision is, you are still in the game.
For instance, in this example, they are explicitly asking you to collect new data. So in this case, it's going to be a major revision, but you have to collect new data, and the data should be good. Or sometimes some editors are very, very fair, and they tell you, you have to collect new data, and as long as you collect the new data, and if the data do not fit with the previous experiment, as long as you have a nice explanation, I would be willing to accept the paper anyway. Other editor, let's say, they are not so open, so they ask for new data, and the data should exactly fit the story, otherwise rejection.
I don't know if I'm anticipating something, but so if I am, just stop me. But when you read this kind of letter, you have to have in mind the decision-making process, not your reading, but the decision-making process, which means that the editors is not the same as a reviewer. So you read the reviewers on the level of the editors, not personal. Then you read it personal. But what I mean is that sometimes you have editors who say nothing, and you understand that this is everything has to do with the review. So basically, the editor either is not expert, because well, we involved in this, or just it's a kind of okay. Two agree, one disagree, so we reject. Otherwise, other times you see the editor put stuff on it, that emphasizes some things instead of others. Don't give the same weight to these things like to the reviewer. Give more weight to the editors than the reviewer. Because again, the decision-making process, the editor makes the decision, not the reviewer. So you have to reply in a way that the editors please after the reviewer, but not the reviewer only. So you have to bear in mind this. And also when you read it, you have to be doing this.
Even if, so I don't know about your experience. So when you are an editor and the decision is major revision, and you ask for, I don't know, additional data, for instance, then you receive the revision. You can either decide by yourself if the paper should be accepted or not, or you can decide to send the paper out again to reviewers. I think it depends also on the journal. So for instance, at PSPB, the rule, as long as you can decide by yourself, that should be the path, because you speed the review process. But I know that some journals, when you receive the revision, you ask to the previous reviewers, and sometimes you add new reviewers to comment on it, which is tricky, because if you select new reviewers on the revision,
it's an endless process.
It's an endless process. So minor revision is very unlikely. Most of the time they say, oh, you have to change just 2 or 3 things, and as long as they ask you to submit like in 30 days, that means that the paper will be accepted, and sometimes the editor explicitly states that the paper will not be sent out for the review. So in that case, you may be happy. But minor revision at the 4th round, it's very, very unlikely, but it may happen. Why not?
I can make a point by linking up what has been done, what has been said before and now. Before, they said, I mean, Jan said, I mean, the manuscript is a living thing, it's not the end of the manuscript. Just think about the revision. I mean, after you receive this, you have to read again. You have to work again. You have to read a sense. So, which means, don't think that it's over until it's over. And it's not over when it's over. It's over when you do the revisions, so on. Which means, still, you have to be willing to keep your grades. This is what is needed. And so to do all the changes, if you think it's worth it, to do all the kind of changes, if you agree on the impact research, to do all the changes that need to be done. So, and that's, I think, sometimes is, especially at the beginning, you need to have some kind of grit, some kind of resistance, some resilience, because this can sometimes be discouraging at first, because there's so many things to do. Okay, especially at the beginning, but you need to keep going, because it's a process.
As long as I met your review, I mean, the first year of my postdoc was back in 2011. I got 18 rejection straight. So when I received my first major revision, they asked me to rewrite entirely the manuscript, I was like crying by joy and say, okay, I got a major revision after 18 rejection. Resubmission, in this case, I mean, in the resubmission, what I suggest is in the manuscript, all the changes that you made, I usually put all the changes in a different color, like in red, showing the editor that I took his or her comments very, very seriously, and all the changes can be easily located in the manuscript. And then you usually include a cover letter in which you say point by point what you did to address the reviewers and the editor comment, point by point. So what I do in my lab is for every point I provide a reply. Sometimes it's very, very brief. Other times is longer when they ask you to, I don't know, do some additional analysis. I put in the cover letter, I did the analysis, and these are the results. So usually the cover letter in my resubmission is very, very long because I want to show the reviewers that I did everything they asked me, and I'm gonna provide you in the cover letter everything I did should be in the cover letter. So you should be persuaded to see that I work hard. I don't like cover letters and resubmission. Point 1, we did this, please check page 10. On this point, yes, we rewrite the introduction, please see page 2. I prefer writing in the cover letter exactly what I did. So it's better for the editor, it's better for the reviewer. You show that you work hard. Do you agree?
I agree completely. Completely. No, and I still have with a lot of my collaborators that that they tend to underestimate the importance of the cover letter revision. And you always need to. I always try to make the paper even more humble, the cover letter even more humble and responsive. Show that you have taken into account the comments and did your best to really improve the paper based on the comments. And put your time into writing that letter, because also as an editor, that's what you pay most attention to. I, as an editor, didn't go and reread the whole paper. I focus on the cover letter and then check whether indeed the changes made that were said to be made in the cover letter are made in the manuscript.
I agree, entirely agree. I would like a couple of things. First, you can also say disagree with the cover letter. You have to be polite, but you can do that. If there are things that you think was a mistake or shouldn't be wrong, you think that's not the right way to go, you can do that. Remember that you are, it's as if you are talking to somebody, so be polite. Be diplomatic and do these things. Because otherwise there is a risk that it becomes a kind of crash or kind of things. That's the first. And the second, that's my personal way of doing this. I don't know whether you're the same. I never work on the manuscript first. Always work on the parent. And all the after, I start working on the manuscript. First, I have to be satisfied with the reply letter, and then I go try to do the things that I said was going to do. I don't know if you have the same sort of approach.
Mixed. Sometimes I rewrite the paper first. It can be a mix. For some comments, I might first try how it works in the manuscript, and then for others, I'll first do the cover letter and then but the most important thing to realize is also here, think of this poor editor, because this editor it's a job on top of a job. So he simply wants to make the decisions as efficiently as possible. So make the cover letter as clear as possible, put everything in there, so that the editor doesn't have to look for where things. Think of the poor editor and have that image in your head of a guy, and then you will be much more compassionate and responsive.
Well, one thing that happens to me quite often is that at least one comment paper is about the reviewer didn't see something that was already in the manuscript. Yes. So one of the tricks that I use, I don't know if it can be, if it's acceptable, if it's used by other people, is I change a tiny little bit of the sentence that is already in the manuscript, and I say, we now say this. So I don't have to point to the fact that they didn't read the paper very clearly.
What I would do then is, if we already pointed it out, but we clarified it by...
Clarified. Thanks for this.
Yeah. Thank you for the comment, and please accept our apology for not being so clear. In the new version of the manuscript, I always start saying, like these sentences, like, thank you, we thank the reviewer for pointing this out, thank you, this is an amazing suggestion, stuff like that. And if you do not do something, start always thanking the reviewer, and then use the American style, like we agree with the reviewer that, however, but at least at the beginning you thank and you say, yes, you're right, but please keep in mind, or please, we would prefer, but I don't know if the reviewers share our opinion about this. We are very looking forward to knowing what the reviewers think about this new frame, stuff like that.
Sometimes choose also the other reviewers.
Oh, yes.
Because often there are conflicting comments where they say, oh, that's a great point, because you say, say, as suggested by the reviewer one, we follow this kind of advice. And
related to this point, that is basically figured that one of the has the expand section and the other one the string section. How do you manage this? I usually do what I want and say I have to keep balance between these two opinions.
Because that works. Yeah, that's also important to remember in the whole process. You have to be accommodating, but you don't have to destroy your own paper. You have to make sure that the paper stays good. So you choose the option that you think is best.
you clean your children, but not in your farm. You keep someone alive.
I mean, if an editor asks you to change entirely a manuscript, even the story behind the manuscript, that should be a rejection, because the editor doesn't have the right to tell you what story you should tell. It's your story.
If you want to write the paper, do it.
But here again, it's an issue of taking the perspective, especially the perspective of the editor. Really put yourself in his or her place while doing this. And the best way to know what that perspective is to become an editor yourself at some point. So if you get the offer to edit something, accept it. Even I wouldn't do it for Frontiers, but for most other journals, I would say yes, because it's a really good way to learn about it.
Also for MPPI.
Yeah.
Which I discovered another play.
Which?
MPPI. It's like a consortium. They have like 30 papers, 30 journals, and you have to pay to publish there. It's even worse than Frontiers. Like in Spain, which is not in the United States in terms of publication, they decided that for promotion and to evaluate the CV of postdocs and assistant professor, all the papers published in Frontiers and in the journals of that consortium, they will not be evaluated. Wow. Because the review process in those journals is not clear, and so they decided if you want, you can publish there. Of course, you are free to do that, but in order to evaluate your career, those journals will not be considered. Yeah, I know. Producing human science seems good. Yeah, but even if it's important, let's see, if you are in a committee. Even in reputation, okay. Okay.
I mean, producing psychology.
Producing psychology, in my opinion, if you have one paper on frontiers psychology, is fine. Two is fine as well. But if you have your CV full of frontiers, that for me is a red flag.
But in producing neuroscience, no.
Okay. Don't blame the reviewers, even if you think they are wrong, as you said. You can say bad things in the lab with your collaborators, but not in the cover letter. You can say, oh, the reviewer was wrong, the reviewer didn't understand maybe you're not familiar with this model. You should do that because you're putting together, you're forcing yourself. I mean, you're very, you can see very easily the rejection. You can share your thoughts with your collaborators, and but not in the cover letter. And stay strong because rejection is always around the corner, guys, and that's our job. And that's it.